Hello, and welcome to our discussion on survey research designs. Today we'll be talking about survey research designs, and then we'll reserve some time in class for you to do an in-class exercise on survey research designs. Before we get started though with today's discussion, please make sure, as always, you have the PowerPoint lecture notes printed and in front of you so that you can take notes as we go. I'll be asking you to stop the video on several occasions in this particular presentation, and we'll ask you to make notes at that time so that you can respond very appropriately and in an informed manner in class. So let's take a look at this idea of survey research designs, and we'll set the stage just a little bit by hearkening back to something that we discussed earlier. We talked about different survey methods, and we had a variety of methods. One method was an in-person survey, another was a telephone survey. We had the good old-fashioned snail mail surveys, and then we had the more contemporary internet surveys, which might be done on a website. They might be done by way of Twitter or by Facebook or maybe by email. Any of those would be different kinds of research survey methods. And now what we're going to talk about is different kinds of designs. And we can marry any one of those methods to any number of designs, and we can mix and match in very interesting kinds of ways. Today we're going to be talking about 3 different kinds of survey research designs, and you'll see that it's not even just for survey research. You can do other kinds of observational studies or experiments using these different designs. So there are 3 of them, and the first of these is going to be our cross-sectional design. And the cross-sectional design is going to be characterized by taking multiple samples that are drawn from the population at one time. Okay, so you can think about having this be representing a snapshot of the population in time. And I think that's a pretty good phrase, a snapshot in time. So what we'll ask you to do in just a moment is to generate some examples of cross-sectional designs. I'll give you a couple to warm you up, and then I'll see if you can apply this idea of a cross-sectional design to areas of interest for you within psychology. So I'll start out with a kind of design that's cross-sectional that won't directly pertain to psychology. Maybe we're talking about an election, and we're interested in how different people are going to be inclined to vote for different kinds of candidates. So we might take, for example, at one point in time, samples from the north, south, east, and west. So all of these are taken at one time. It's one snapshot in time, but we're taking regionally different samples. And we might see that one particular candidate is favored in one region, but not in the next region. We might take samples at one time that differ by, say, political orientation. We might look at Republicans versus Democrats, and that would be 2 different groups of folks that are being sampled at one time. They're being sampled cross-sectionally. An important note about all of this is you can think of a cross-sectional design as being a between subjects design. So the folks who are in one sample are definitionally not in the other sample. Okay? We can use other kinds of demographic groupings. We can use something like age. We can use gender. Lots of different ways to group if we're interested in the issue of who's going to be voting which way in the upcoming presidential election. So what I'll ask you to do is, for the moment, stop the video and see if you can come up with some interesting psychological questions that you might be sampling cross-sectionally. Okay, welcome back. We'll continue our conversation about cross-sectional designs. I do want to emphasize one point, and that is that determining what kind of design that you use will put important constraints on how you interpret the data that you get. And we'll see some examples of those. For the moment, we're talking about cross-sectional designs, and we're going to move on to talking about some possible limitations of cross-sectional designs. I've already alluded to one of these, and that is that by definition, we're taking a snapshot in time. All by itself, that might not seem like a limitation, but very often psychologists are interested in how behaviors, thoughts, and feelings and attitudes change over time. And you can't measure that change across time using a cross-sectional design. It's just not part of what the design can do. So this might bring us then to another one of our 3 designs that we'll be talking about today. This is design number 2, and it is the successive independent samples design, which is a series of cross-sectional studies conducted over time. They're conducted in succession, they're conducted successively, or one after the next, hence the name that you see here, successive independent samples designs. Okay? So what we can say about this is it has a couple of important features if you're going to do it well. First, the same questions have to be asked on each occasion. And secondarily, the different samples over time should be drawn from the same population. So we'll use an example or two that might be most relevant to college students, And this is being recorded at Denison University, so I'll use Denison University students as an example. What we might choose to do here is have a successive independent samples design that tries to get at the issue of the anxiety that so many students face during their first week of class, especially in their first year. So these are brand new college students, new on their campus, new here to the Denison campus, and we might have some kind of a survey that asks first year, first week students here at Denison about their anxiety levels. And we would do that during the first week of classes. And then what we would do is follow up 1 year later with the then new incoming group and ask them exactly the same questions as we had the last time, and the year after that we would do the same. So every year, maybe for 20 years, we could trace this pattern out, always taking the first year, first week students. So in an important sense, even though these are different people, it's always the same population. Remember that a population is every member of a group, and we're always thinking about that group of people who happen to be here at Denison as first-year students during their first week. That group of people will change over time. That is to say, we'll slide out some current students in that group and slide in some new students. So these are, in fact, independent samples. It's a type of between subjects design, just like the cross-sectional design was between subjects. But now we're doing this more like the frames of a movie rather than a single snapshot. Okay? So we'll see if you can stop the video now and generate some of your own examples of a successive independent samples design, relating it in some way to a topic within psychology that is of interest to you. Okay, welcome back. We might ask, what are some possible limitations of a successive independent samples design? And one idea that might come up is that even though we're showing how a group of people might change over time, we're not showing how an individual changes. And sometimes psychologists are very interested in that issue. How do individuals change across time? Okay? But let's just stay here for a moment, and we'll return to the example we had discussed previously about having an anxiety measure for all of the incoming students at a college campus, for example here at Denison, during the first week of their first year. You might imagine that, at least in principle, it would be possible for us to get a changing response over maybe a 20 or 30 year period. For example, it might be the case that in the overall world population, students who are coming into college are now much more relaxed than they used to be. They might be much more anxious than they used to be. I don't know which way that would go, but it could go in either direction over maybe a 20 or 30 year period. And a successive independent samples design could pick that up and could reflect how the overall population of college students is experiencing their anxiety during their first week at one time, say 30 years ago, versus the contemporary students. Okay, so we could see it in that way. It might be the case that they're more anxious or that they are less anxious. We can see changes in the overall grouping of folks, the overall population of folks, even though we're not seeing how a given individual changes. If we want to see how a given individual changes, this would not be an appropriate design. We'd have to go on to a different kind of design. But before we do that, I do want to show us one other example of a successive independent samples design. Okay, so let's take a look at this. And I'll first walk us through this very nice graph by Sachs et al. From 2003. Here, they're again looking at young students like you. These are students who are coming into college, and they're looking across, in this case, a 30-year interval from the year 1966 through the year 1996. So they're asking this question every year for those 30 years for the incoming students. And they're asking them about why they're coming to college and what they hope to get out of the experience. And they're really tracking the extent to which these new college students endorse or say they support different kinds of statements. Frequently in survey research, we talk about the extent to which a respondent will endorse an item, and that means how strongly they favor or agree with that particular item. So you might imagine that you're given something like a 7-point scale, where a 7 would mean that you're responding that this particular item is absolutely essential, it's very important, and I agree with it very strongly. Or you might say, I find it very important, but maybe not essential, and we can get your degree of endorsement. Okay? So on the y-axis, we're tracking the percent of essential or very important responses. These are relatively strong endorsements across these years to these two different items. And I realize that these are hard to see on the video, so I'll read them to you. One is develop a meaningful philosophy of life. Okay? So to what extent do people endorse that it is important that we develop a meaningful philosophy of life while in college? versus be very well off financially. Okay, that might be another reason for going to college. So we have the philosophical bit, we have the financial bit, two different aspects that might be motivating you to go to college, two different ideas about why you should be in college, and we ask the extent to which you endorse each of these. What might be obvious to you, I hope the red is coming through, back in 1966 we were getting substantially higher endorsement for develop a meaningful philosophy of life, and that tended to trend downward over time. By contrast, over that same interval of time, for the same individuals now, at least the members from the same population, we have developed a meaningful philosophy of life coming down, and we have be very well off financially trending upward. Okay, so these are successive independent samples, but they are giving us some notion about what the college population on a large scale is doing across this 30-year time span. Okay, so we might ask in your own words to explain this study and its relevance to successive independent samples. And I think I've given you most of that there, but we'll see if you can provide a summary of this. And if I were to ask you in class, we'd see how you respond. We'll let you stop the video and summarize this. Okay, welcome back. Now we're going to go on to our third type of design for the various research survey designs that we have, and this is called the longitudinal design. And the same sample of respondents is surveyed more than once in a longitudinal design. Our memory trick for this is longitudinal is over a long time. You can see the word long here, so we're taking the same individuals over a long period of time, and this is longitudinal. So we can ask, what are some pros and cons associated with a longitudinal design? We'll give you a moment to think about those and jot those down. Okay, welcome back. So hopefully you have something like this. One of the nice things about a longitudinal design is that we can see how a given individual changes across time. And we can do that for every member in our sample, so long as we can get them at time 1 and time 2 and time 3 and so forth. We can see how individuals are changing, and that would not be possible in the context of a successive independent samples design. So this kind of design, longitudinal design, is distinct from the other two in that the longitudinal design is within subjects, and you might make a note of that. This is the only one of the three that is within subjects, so we're getting the same people at each measurement time. In the other two cases, we had a between subject design. This is similar to the successive independent samples design in the sense that this is now giving us something more than a snapshot. It's giving us something more like a movie. We can see the frames of the movie over time. In this case, we're using a longitudinal design and we're tracking the same individuals. So that's nice that we get to have this capacity to check in on a given individual across time and see how that person is maturing. The disadvantage, as you might imagine, is that this can be enormously resource intensive. It can take 20 years to do a longitudinal study that is tracking folks over 20 years. Okay? It requires typically an investment in time that might be beyond the resources of a particular researcher. Some institutions that might be able to track these longitudinal studies would include such groups as maybe the National Science Foundation, maybe the National Institutes of Health. The idea there is that these are governmentally supported institutions that are probably going to be around for many, many decades. That seems plausible. Whereas a given researcher might come and go based on health issues or career changes and so forth, but it might be the case that something like a National Science Foundation group or an NIH group could fund this essentially in perpetuity, so that we really can track individuals across decades if we're so inclined. It's a big investment in time, but we also get tremendous information about how individuals mature. And this is only possible through the longitudinal design, which, as we've mentioned, is within subjects. Okay. On the issue of longitudinal designs, what is meant by attrition, sometimes also called mortality? We'll let you see if you can muse about that or engage in your readings in some way and see what we mean by attrition or mortality within the context of longitudinal designs. We'll give you a moment on that. Okay, welcome back, and we'll go to our next potential pop quiz question. Explain how the issue of respondent attrition, which is what we just defined up here, how does respondent attrition related to the issue of response bias? Okay, so how are those two notions? We've talked previously about response bias. How does that relate to respondent attrition? This will take quite a bit of critical thinking, but I'm hoping that if you're really trying to connect these ideas across lectures, you'll be able to do this. So we'll give you a moment to think that one through. Okay, welcome back. We'll see if I can help you out with an answer to this one. The idea here is that when we have mortality inside of our longitudinal design, what we're talking about is not necessarily that somebody has died in a literal sense, although that is possible. If you imagine sampling 1,000 people now, and then you come back maybe every 5 years as a hypothetical, it's possible that some of those folks won't be here in 5 years. So that is one way of thinking about attrition or mortality. But more generally, it's not that the people literally die. It's only that they've died, in essence, within your study. That is, it might be the case that they moved out of the area and they've left no contact information. Okay? That happens quite frequently. So we have only some people who are remaining, and we might now have some kind of a response bias. I'll say more about response bias in a moment. One other factor that contributes sometimes to attrition is that maybe you do have contact information, but for whatever reason, people are disinclined to continue in the longitudinal study. Maybe they've been sampled at the 5-year mark, the 10-year mark, and you ask them at the 15-year mark the same set of questions, and they don't want to participate anymore. They'd rather not be bothered. This is surely their prerogative. We've talked previously about the importance of ethics in research, and an important ethical component in any kind of research, including longitudinal research, is the idea that the participant can stop at any time. They have that choice, and that's partly what makes a study ethical. So we have to respect the right of the participant to opt out at any time, and when the participant opts out, we have a form of attrition. Now, what can be very interesting is it might be the case that we get a non-random opting out of our participants. Maybe, for whatever reasons, people of one gender opt out more than do people of the other gender. It might be that people in different SES brackets, socioeconomic status brackets, opt out at different rates. It might be that folks who are of different political inclinations opt out differentially. So what then happens is you might have had a beautiful sample early on, and maybe the first couple of offerings of this longitudinal study had been administered in a very equal way, a way that was very representative of the overall group. But as time went on, we got some attrition, and if the attrition were non-random, then the folks who are persisting are not necessarily reflective of the original distribution, and that would be a problem. So it's something to think about, this issue of attrition or mortality when we're dealing with longitudinal studies. Okay, let's go over to a potential pop quiz question. And these are some hypothetical data that I'll show to you. I'll first give you the pop quiz question, then I'll walk you through the table. So the question here is, explain how the interpretation of this table could change depending on whether the research design was longitudinal versus successive independent samples. And let's just see if we can make this really clear to you. I've made this data set up, but here's the idea. You can imagine that we were interested in taking some survey data on the question of stricter airport passenger screening procedures. So many of us have had the experience of going into an airport, and we get screened rather carefully for safety reasons. And you might have asked questions about the extent to which people are okay with stricter screening procedures back in 1982. Okay, and then you might ask it 20 years later in the year 2002. So there's a 20-year difference. And we can ask, do you favor stricter airport passenger screening? Are you opposed to it? Are you unsure? And of course, some people might choose not to answer. Okay, so let's just take a look at what's happened here and these hypothetical data. In 1982, 10% of respondents favored stricter screening. Okay? In the year 2002, 20 years later, that number increased to 80%. So a really substantial increase between 1982 and 2002. Okay? Then we have a corresponding fall off, almost the same in size. We had 60% who were opposed in 1982 to stricter screening, and that number dropped to just 10% 20 years later in 2002. Right? Then the number of people who are unsure also dropped off. Many fewer people, just 8%, were unsure in 2002, as contrasted with 1/4 or 25% of the group in 1982. And no answer was fairly small in each case, with a relatively small drop in the number of folks who were unsure in 2002. So what we might ask is something along the lines of, how would we begin to interpret this outcome, this change that we see from 1982 to 2002, if we had administered this in accordance with a longitudinal design versus if we had administered this in accordance with a successive independent samples design? We get very different, potentially very different kinds of interpretations, and I'd like you to spell out what those interpretations are. We'll let you stop the video and respond to that pop quiz question. Okay, welcome back. Now what I'd like you to do is, if you're in front of a computer screen, I hope you'll copy and paste this PubMed ID into your web browser and take a look at this one paragraph description of a very interesting study done by Heatherton in 1997. This was done at Dartmouth College, and very interesting on the issue of eating disorders. Here we have a very striking picture of somebody who's struggling with anorexia, and you can see that it's really having quite a toll on this person's body. So eating disorders are of great interest to all of us. They might be particularly interesting to college students. So we'll let you read through that paragraph and then see if you could describe the study as best you can, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. You can stop the video, and I'll give you a summary in a moment as well. Okay, welcome back. So as hopefully you've read by now in that one paragraph summary, there was a longitudinal design that was conducted by Heatherton. And the idea was to sample people who were in college about their body satisfaction and about their disordered eating. And they looked at men and women separately in this study, and they asked people who are roughly your age how they were doing on these two measures, eating disorders and body satisfaction. And what was very interesting was they came back 10 years later, and the folks were at that time in their early 30s, and the issue had become, were there any changes in their disordered eating and any changes in body satisfaction? Some good news, I think, some significant changes for the women in the study, and that is that the prevalence of disordered eating had dropped, and it in fact dropped substantially from the time they were in college to the time they were in their 30s. Secondly, other good news for women had been that the body satisfaction levels went up generally in their 30s relative to what they had been in their 20s, at least for women. Men, interestingly, showed a relatively flatter pattern. There were not as dramatic differences for men as there had been for women, and some men in their 30s were reporting a little bit more disordered eating. In fact, there were more people reporting disordered eating among the men in their 30s than men in their 20s, but that number was not really quite as dramatic a change as we had seen for the women. So we saw a gender difference there, and we have this longitudinal design dealing with an important issue for all of us, and that is eating disorders. All right, let's see if we can now try to stretch ourselves just a little bit, and we'll apply the idea of a cross-sectional study and a longitudinal study to something that goes perhaps beyond surveys. As we said, you can use these for different kinds of surveys. You can use these various designs, mixing and matching them with different survey methods, but you can even use them for different kinds of studies that might be not survey-based. We can imagine giving tests that might be about cognitive reasoning ability. Okay, so now we're moving away from something that's purely survey-based to something that might be performance-based. And we can do these studies also cross-sectionally, or we can do them longitudinally. So let's just take a look at what this might be. In the cross-sectional study, we might have a study in which people of different ages are compared at a given time, maybe on some kind of cognitive reasoning test. And the example might be we would compare people who are turning 20 this year on a cognitive reasoning test, it might be computer-based, for example, to those who are turning 40 this year. So this could even, in principle, be administered on the web, and we might not be asking about attitudes, but we might be measuring behavior, specifically the extent to which people can solve problems that are involving critical reasoning. Okay? We can give that over the internet to 20-year-olds this year and 40-year-olds this year. And this would be cross-sectional because any given individual is not in both of those groups. Again, as we've said, this is a snapshot in time, and it's also done between subjects. Let's see how we might revisit that same kind of study, but now we'll do it in a longitudinal manner. So now this is a study in which the sample of people tested at time 1 will be tested again at some future point in time. Okay? And we can say that each participant's performance will be measured at age 20, for example, on this test, and then we're going to try to track them down 20 years later when they're turning 40 years old, and we measure the same people 20 years later. Okay? So this is an example of the same kind of reasoning ability test being administered either cross-sectionally or longitudinally. Okay? Okay, now we're going to come to an important interpretive challenge for you. I'll see if I can spell out some hypothetical data from the study that we might have just described a while back. So here we're measuring reasonability score on the y-axis. That'll be our dependent variable. And we see that the scores are ranging from a low of 10, we'll say that's 10% correct, to something like low 60% correct. So this is a fairly challenging reasoning ability test. And we're looking at age in years. Okay? So we're checking people at different times in their life. And we're doing this either longitudinally or cross-sectionally. And in this blue diamond, you can see that we have longitudinal measures, and in the red squares, we have cross-sectional measures. And what's interesting is these two different kinds of measures are showing very different kinds of patterns. So why might these methods produce very different results is a question for you to think about. We'll let you stop the video and see if you can generate an answer to that question. Okay, welcome back. We'll move on, and we'll introduce our final topic for this discussion, and we'll talk about something called a cohort effect, which is very important whenever we're thinking about developmental psychology, and many students have an interest in developmental psychology. We can think about development as being how people change from infancy into young childhood, and young childhood into adolescence, and then across their adult lives. We can talk about how people are performing, or what their attitudes might be in young adulthood, middle adulthood, and older adulthood as well. So we can think along this full developmental spectrum in terms of a cohort effect, and we'll define what a cohort is first. In developmental studies, it's a group of individuals who share a birth year or maybe a range of birth years. Okay? So people who are similar to you in age would be your cohort in developmental studies. So what is the cohort effect? We can define that as an influence that can be attributed to a particular year of birth or maybe a range of birth years rather than age per se. And this is tricky. This is a subtle point. So hopefully you can focus in on this and see if you can grasp this. We'll give you an example of a cohort effect by looking back here as one possibility. We'll ask you to think about what it means to be measuring the behavior, in this case the reasoning ability behavior, of a 30-year-old at different points in time. So let's take the example of somebody who was born in 1930 and is now taking this test in 1960. Okay? And let's contrast that with the possibility of somebody who was born in, say, the late 1960s or 1970, and they're taking this test, this cognitive reasoning ability test, at age 30 at about the time of the turn of the century, coming into the 21st century. Okay? They're 30-year-olds either way. How might these two groups be different from each other? What we can say is that it might be true that in 1930, the environment in which any child was raised was very different than had been the environment in the late 1960s or early 1970s. As some of you might know, across the world, and certainly in the US in the 1930s, we had a Great Depression. It was a time of great food scarcity. A lot of folks were literally hungry. A lot of folks were cold in the winter and really hot in the summer. The physical living conditions were much tougher. Imagine during that sensitive developmental period of the first few years of life, you're raised in that kind of environment. Then 30 years later, we might be measuring cognitive performance on you after you've gone through that relatively difficult growing up period. In the 1930s, the Great Depression. By contrast, imagine that we're measuring somebody in the year 2000 or the late 1990s. They're 30 years old at that time, and they would have been born in the late 1960s or early 1970s. Generally speaking, in the US, and I think largely around the world, conditions had improved. The economy had gotten much better. Food scarcity was really not the issue that it had been back in the 1930s. So now you're looking again at 30-year-olds, just like you were a while back, but we're not necessarily comparing 30-year-olds in a very fair manner because they had very different kinds of growing up experiences, one in the Depression, one in time of relative wealth. Okay? We might call this a cohort effect. We'll return to that definition. And the definition, again, is an influence that can be attributed to a particular year of birth, say the 1930s versus the late 1960s or 1970s, rather than to age per se. Okay? So these groups are both 30 years old, but they had very different environments. This is a cohort effect, and it might alter how we think about interpreting these data, and it might actually be driving some of the differences that we see here. So what we'll do is, in class, we'll see if we can have you work with a partner or two, and we'll see what kinds of survey research methods, which would include in-person interviews or telephone interviews, mail surveys or internet surveys, might be married with these three different kinds of research designs. Again, by summary, the research designs were the cross-sectional design, the successive independent samples design, and the longitudinal design. And in class, we'll have you work on putting these ideas together with some survey methods, and we'll see what we come up with. Before we do that, though, please make sure that you've noted on your PowerPoint lecture notes what was clear and what was less clear. I'll see you in class.